Yu-Gi-Oh! At the core, it is a card game with more than 10,000 cards. Obviously, this incentivizes players to be creative with their decks, right? I'm here today to talk about that question, the problems that I see with Yu-Gi-Oh! Today, and even a potential fix. So let's say you go into your attic, and there you find an old box, which actually contains Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, right? And in it, you find the card Pot of Greed. Then you should surely be able to play it, right? Well, no. You can research it, but simply because this card is so good that if you were allowed to play it, then literally everyone would play this card. Such cards are called staples. And I just wanted to introduce you to this term because this will be important for the continuation of this video. And imagine if now we had like 5 of these so-called staples, then we would always know nearly half of every deck that is played, which logically gets burned really quickly, so luckily Konami has made a ban list to prevent this from happening. Another term that I should introduce is the word meta. This is basically the best way to play a game. In Yu-Gi-Oh! This means the best cards or the best decks that you can play with. The term modern meta obviously flows from that. This is basically currently the best way that you could play the game. Alright, with all that out of the way and already a minute into the video, I can finally begin to explain what I think is wrong with the modern meta. So throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! I think Konami has made 3 major mistakes. And the first mistake being the new extra deck monsters. Hold up, modern experienced players, I can already hear you. I'm not just some old school player who is reluctant to learn the new summoning methods or mechanics. I'm actually even a fan of some of the new extra deck monsters, but only a select few. And why? Because they all have incredibly generic materials. So in 2008, Synchro monsters were released. They require a tuner monster to get on the field, and the total stars of the materials must equal the number of stars of the Synchro monster. And don't get me wrong, it's a really cool summoning mechanic if you ask me, but it's the materials that are required to get the monster on the field, which are the problem.
So the problem is that the materials to get the monsters on the field are way too generic. Take for example Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. This is a great monster, but it's actually part of the Ice Barrier archetype, which probably most people won't even know. Because this card is it requires 1 tuner and 2+ non-tuner monster, and that goes the same for every other Synchro monster. But as long as you just run 1 tuner in your deck, and you can eventually add up the total number of stars among these 3 monsters, or even more monsters, up to a total of 9, which is obviously the case not only in the Ice Barrier deck, but in other decks as well, then you can run this monster. And let's make an assumption that this card would be incredibly powerful, right? Which it is. Then you can just run this card in every deck, right? Why wouldn't you? If you could go into this card, then it would be an amazing addition to your deck, regardless of what kind of deck you're playing. And there are many more cards like this, like for example Black Rose Dragon. Black Rose Dragon is a really good card, which is part of the Rose Dragon archetype. But again, it only requires 1 tuner and 1+ non-tuner monsters, and if you can add up to 7 stars with these monsters, then you can easily put it in every other deck as well, right? And it happens to have a really good effect, which can be useful in any deck, because when this card is synchro summoned, you can destroy all cards on the field. Well, if that isn't convenient, right? So you can just put this card in every deck, and the same goes for a lot of other monsters. Borrel Savage Dragon is an example. If you've played the game a little bit, then you know about this card. It gets splashed into every deck. So Borrel Savage Dragon, you have Naturia Beast, this card. You have Chaos Ruler. It's part of the Chaos archetype technically, but yeah, this also, it has a really good effect. You can just splash it into every other deck, and you can imagine that's what happened. These cards actually did get splashed into every deck, not only the deck that they actually belong to.
So after having the Synchro monsters out for a good few years, it was shown that the majority of the Synchro monsters were splashed in every deck, outside of the archetype they were actually intended to be played in. So what did Konami do to combat this? Exactly, they released the XYZ monsters, which were even more easily splashable into every deck. Because the XYZ monsters only require 2 monsters of the same level to be on the field, and needless to say, you can easily accomplish this in every deck. On the real though, the XYZ monsters were likely released because the archetypes which were printed before 2008 didn't include any tuner monsters or tuner support, so it must have been unfair.
So let's have a look at some of these amazing new XYZ monsters. For example, Time Thief Redoer. It's actually part of the Time Thief archetype, which is probably an archetype that most people don't even know of, but this card gets splashed into every deck because it requires level 4 monsters, and level 4 monsters is probably the most famous of level of monsters that actually gets played in the main deck, which can still be normal summoned from the hand. So yeah, this card just gets splashed into every deck. Yeah, you can imagine how this goes. We have a lot more examples. True King of All Calamities is part of the True King and True Draco archetype, but it also has an effect that works with that, but that never gets used. It just has a way super OP effect, which actually has this card banned in the TCG already. But yeah, monsters like that. We also have Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal. That's actually a monster which is a Burning Abyss archetype monster. Yeah, so it's related to the Burning Abyss archetype, but again, it has a really good effect, and it only needs 2 level 6 monsters in this case. So as long as you run level 6 monsters in any form of shape, then you just include this card in your deck because it's that good. You have a lot more monsters. You can imagine, like, all of the XYZ monsters have things like this. You have Tornado Dragon, you have Baguska, I think, yeah. And I didn't even mention Zeus, of course. This card, I've learned this card, like I met this card in the game Master Duel that I'm showing right now, and it actually has an alternative summoning mechanic. So this is 2 level 12 monster. This actually has an alternative summoning mechanic, namely, if an XYZ monster battled this turn, you can also XYZ summon this card by using 1 XYZ monster you control's material. So you can easily get this card on the field. It basically has a super strong OP effect. You can read it here if you want to and pause the screen. But yeah, that's the reason why this card gets splashed into every single deck if you play XYZ monsters. Even if you don't play XYZ monsters, you just put in some of your XYZ monsters because they're easy to get out anyway, right? You can definitely find an XYZ monster which has the levels that you are playing, requires the level of monsters that you are playing, and you can always get this monster on the field, and it has a super strong effect. It's way too overpowered, right? And that's what happened with cards like these. All right.
So, after having seen how the Synchro monsters became staples in most decks, and now also having seen how the XYZ monsters became staples as well, far outside of their own archetype, they must have learned from it, right? I mean, they made an entire ban list, which I showed at the beginning of the video. They made the ban list to avoid every deck from including the same cards in their deck, so essentially to exclude staples from the game. That's why cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity are banned. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I present to you, for the players who don't want to play tuners, for the players who do not want to play multiple monsters of the same level, you can now just use any of your monsters you desire for your extra deck plays, with Link monsters. All jokes aside, in case the previous extra deck monsters weren't generic enough yet, at the end of 2016, Konami released Link monsters. For these Link monsters you can use anything you like as material, even tokens. By now it barely matters that the Link monsters even have a name or that they are even a part of an archetype.
Alright, let's have a look at some of these Link monsters. There are actually way too many to actually consider here, but yeah, I guess I could show a few of them. This is actually Predaplant Verte Anaconda. It's part of the Predap archetype. But yeah, like I said, it really doesn't matter that they're even part of an archetype anymore, or even have a name at all, in my opinion, because what do they require? 2 effect monsters. Come on. Which deck does not run this, right? And it actually has a really generic effect as well, which takes into account fusion spell cards or apolymerization. So you can just play this, and it is splashed in every deck that actually runs any form of fusion monsters. So yeah, it really, again, doesn't matter that it's even part of an archetype anymore. But yeah, that's that monster. We also have Mecha Phantom Beast. Oh, that's Beats, and we can't backspace, so we have to type it all over. Phantom Beast. Mecha Phantom Beast, Auroradon. Yeah, Auroradon is the name. So yeah, basically this is a monster. It takes 2 machine monsters, but you can easily go into it with another card that I'll show in a little bit. It's called Crystron Halqifibrax. And yeah, it special summons tokens, so and like I said, tokens can even be used for the Link summon, so it's infinitely more valuable now that you can easily like bring out a lot more monsters. And you bring out this monster, you bring out 3 more tokens, you bring out more monsters from the extra deck. You can imagine how it kind of will go. Crystron, it's like this, yeah. Crystron Halqifibrax is a monster. It just requires 2 monsters, including a tuner. Hey, so they actually went back to a little bit to the Synchro days. But yeah, it lets you special summon a monster again and go into further plays. You have, oh, by the way, the entire Knighmare package. You have like all the Knighmare monsters. It requires 2 monsters, 2+ monsters actually, with different names. Oh my god. Different names, guys. This is the most generic thing ever. Like, they only have to have different names. So you can imagine you can just splash this in every single deck, and that's what happened. So this monsters, the Knighmare package, it's even a famous term, I guess. It just gets splashed into every single deck. Because why not, right? If you can use, and it also, by the way, has a really useful effect, generic useful effect. It doesn't require you to have Knighmare monsters or something, not at all. So yeah, it's just splashed in every deck. You also have, oh my god, there's so many IP Masquerena. It's a really good card to link summon on your opponent's turn into one of the Knighmare monsters to create some disruption on your opponent's turn. You have Union Carrier. It just equips any monster on from your deck to some monster on your field. It doesn't even list a union monster or anything. It doesn't have to do anything with union things. It's just so weird. Like, okay, so that's basically what all these monsters came up, and I'll talk about it more later in the video.
Because now we're moving on to mistake number 2 that I think Konami has made. I have to say it's not really a huge mistake that we can blame Konami a lot for, because it's all about like when you design your cards in the early days of your card game, you don't really know what your card game is going to be like in 10 years from now. So if you print a really strong effect on a card, then you likely want to limit its use to only once per turn. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Works with soft and hard once per turns. In a nutshell, if you have, for example, 2 times Supply Squad on the field, then you can use both these effects, so you can draw 2 cards. But if you have 3 times Dark Magical Circle on the field, you can only use its effect once per turn to banish 1 card your opponent controls. But I'm not here to go into detail about this difference, but rather want to point out that there are actually cards which don't have a once per turn at all. Why, you may ask? Well, that's because Konami considered the cost of these effects to be so steep that they did not need a once per turn. And while that's true for most cards, as the game progressed, a lot more became possible.
That's for example how cards like Herald of Ultimateness, who actually requires you to send 1 fairy monster from your hand to the graveyard, but which isn't once per turn, how cards like these are broken in the game, because now it is actually possible to get a lot of fairy monsters to your hand, so you can actually use this effect multiple times per turn. And there's also this card Cyber Angel Benten, which required to be tributed, but it's also not once per turn, so it gets heavily abused in the same deck actually, by coincidence. And cards like TG Hyper Librarian, which actually requires a monster to be synchro summoned and then you can draw 1 card. Well, where this wasn't possible back in the day, I think I explained to you during mistake 1 how that is now easily possible. And you can easily pull this off multiple times during 1 turn and essentially draw a lot of cards, which is incredibly powerful in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!
Alright, and with the previous 2 mistakes fully active in practice, I think Konami walked right into the 3rd mistake that I think Konami made. Because due to a lack of a once per turn on some of these cards, but mainly due to the splashable generic extra deck monsters, heavy combo decks became the best way to play. This became the meta. The first turn of each duel became by far the most important turn of the duel, because on that turn you could set up a crazy strong board before your opponent could even start to play. In 2014 Konami already tried to combat this by limiting the first turn player to 5 cards instead of the usual 6 cards. And in 2018 Konami released what they thought a fix was for this problem: hand traps. And that is what I think the 3rd mistake is that Konami made. But what they failed to realize is that this only led to more staples in the deck. I'm showing here a list of the most common main deck staples, and not all of them are hand traps, but definitely the majority is. So let's analyze what Konami's solution to these issues were. Does a card get splashed in too many decks because it's too generically good? Well, we're too far in now to adjust the materials which are required to actually get the monster on the field, so that it would only be limited to be played in the deck that it was actually intended to be played in, so ban the card. Does a card get abused because it lacks a once per turn? Well, we could give it an errata and actually make it a once per turn, but I have to say I can understand that that's confusing for newer players, so let's ban it. So let's look at the results of the mistakes portrayed in this video. The result of the generic extra deck monsters is that if an extra deck monster has a bad or mediocre effect, it just doesn't see play, because why would it? You could just play another monster which actually has the same material requirements and has a better effect. This would make it so that if an extra deck monster like that has a good effect, it will just get splashed into every single deck. In addition to that, it made main deck monsters which can special summon themselves infinitely more valuable than monsters with good attack stats or defense stats or good effects which cannot special summon themselves. Because with those special summoned main deck monsters you can just go into any of the generic extra deck monsters, and that's of course way more consistent because you don't have to draw the extra deck monsters, they are always there. And if you ask me, that gives cards like Plague Spreader Zombie or Glow Bloom or just cards which can special summon tokens way too much credit. And by the way, don't get me wrong, if special summoning main deck monsters and going into extra deck plays is the point of the archetype, then please be my guest and go all out. These are decks like Synchron, Lyrilisk, Virtual World. But then of course you must stick to the archetype related extra deck monsters, the ones which were actually intended to be played in combination with the crazy special summoning main deck monsters, right? And that is of course not what happened. Main deck monsters with great attack stats or great effects quickly fell out of favor because they were best off being replaced by monsters which could easily special summon themselves. Because first of all, that's way more consistent because you always have your extra deck monsters. It doesn't matter which monsters you have on the field as long as they can special summon themselves and actually get the materials on the field to go into your extra deck plays, right? And in turn, this abundance of special summons led to a huge increase of number of actions per turn, which increased the length of each turn, resulting in a lot less back and forth play. Modern meta duels are mainly about knowing each other's decks and each other's combos and knowing which step to negate. And since pretty much every modern meta duel ends in 5 turns or less, a lot of cards which have an effect that only lasts 1 turn became extremely valuable. So the overall result is that the modern meta actually consists of a pool of strong staples, consisting both extra deck staples and main deck staples, of which you must pick a few, but generally the more the merrier, to put in your deck, regardless of which deck you're playing. And if you don't, you're not gonna get far in the modern meta. This takes back to the pot of greed in the box in the attic anecdote. We don't want staples, but yet, here we are. In addition to that, I feel like the game is constantly in a shaky position. There are splashable cards or cards which lack a once per turn that I don't know about at all, that are just laying around waiting to be abused in a future ban list. Now, what if there was a format in which you could keep archetype related cards like Predaplant Verte Anaconda or Time Thief Redoer, but restrict them to only be played in the deck that they were intended to be played in? In this format there would basically only be one rule: play pure Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't matter if you want to build a Blue Eyes White Dragon deck, a Cyber Dragon deck, a Tri-Brigade deck, a Burn deck, a Grand Maju deck, man, you can even mix 2 archetypes together if you think they go well together, as long as you just stick to your own archetype or own playing method within each deck, and be strict on yourself. This would make it so that you cannot use the standard staple cards that I've shown in this video, unless they are of your own archetype, or they fit the playing method that you're trying to focus on within your deck. And since you cannot use the staple extra deck monsters, you cannot combo off like crazy, so this will promote a lot more back and forth play. Because there will be less comboing and less setting up a board, the need for hand traps will be downscaled a lot. Not to mention that they're usually not even allowed because they usually don't fit your archetype. Overall, less staples, less predictable play. In addition to this, logical erratas will be made, which basically means that every card has at least a soft once per turn. I think this format will, at least at first, be most appealing to returning players. The reason I think this format is currently not popular is because it requires players to be familiar with and realize what is wrong with the modern meta. Many returning players are just now busy trying to figure out what a Borrel Savage Dragon is, or an Appaloosa, or an Access Code Talker, and that's why I think that experienced players will enjoy this format a lot as well. It'll be like a challenge for them, to only include cards, resulting in a pure deck, and I'm curious to see what kind of cool decks can be built. I have personally already played in this format for over 3 years and have recently started to set up a quote-unquote ban list for this format. If you're interested in trying out some duels like this, please feel free to contact me or join the Discord to find others who also like to duel in this format. You can find anything you need in the description below. There are already multiple existing formats like the Code format, or you can even consider the OCG and the TCG as different formats. But I've done my research and none of them comes close to the solutions provided in this format. And just to be clear, it's not about a single format to be superior, it's about creating formats so that each player can play a format that they enjoy. Bottom line, the format is here to promote a lot more back and forth play than the current modern meta. Also, it should be a lot less shaky, less susceptible to certain cards becoming incredibly overpowered all of a sudden. But even though I've been playing this format for a long time already, I do not know everything about it, not at all. I don't know how perfect it will be and I don't know how much fixing it will need along the way. Don't know what will become of the format if it's picked up seriously. But I'm incredibly excited to find out.